Welcome back to Debut Writers. We've talked about the steps to take before you write your book or in the early stages of writing it, and now we're going to focus on actually writing your book in this new series.
This can be the hardest part. Where do you even start? We're going to go through some recommendations, and specifically, one place in particular that is incredibly helpful is the book Hook. In our last episode, we talked to Jenny Myers Sain, who's a wonderful author. And if you didn't catch that episode, you've got to go back and subscribe and watch her episode. It's absolutely phenomenal. But she really talked about how her book Hook got her a literary agent, got her a publisher, and then got her readers. So that book hook or that book pitch is so incredibly important. It's that elevator pitch, that kind of thing that you're going to say when people say, "Oh, you wrote a book? What is your book about?" You need to be able to explain that. And first impressions can be really fleeting. So you want to establish that intrigue right away. So a good hook is usually really quick, to the point, one or two sentences. It's juicy. Think of it like reading like a tabloid headline, like you're in the grocery store, like waiting in line and you're like looking it up. I don't think people do this anymore because we have the internet now, but like I used to like be in the line at the grocery store and like reading all the like magazine headlines, like, oh, what's happening in the celebrity world today? But that's what your book needs to do. Cause like every now and again, I get a magazine and there's this one headline and I think, oh, I'm buying this one. I got to read this story. So it's like you've got to think about it like that. And coming up with your book pitch first or your book hook first can really help at the end of the day with your writing and the way you outline and establish your book. So, case in point, A Lost Woman. I just sat down and wrote that thing, right? No outline, just like an idea in my head. I knew where it was going, right? Just completely off the cuff. Sat down and just bullet wrote it in a week. Well, then I go to do a Twitter event. Twitter does all these pitch events, which is like a great opportunity also too to kind of like test to see if your pitch is worth its salt. So I go on and my first pitch event was a complete bomb. I had no likes, no shares. Like I think I had like 5 followers on Twitter at the time because I like just joined for this pitch event and I had no idea how the whole thing went down. But through that event, I gained a lot of following and I gained a lot of friends within the writing community on Twitter. And it's just such a great community, by the way. If you're looking for like an online community, like go #writing community. There's also like the 5 a.m. Moms Writers Club community. There's a lot of communities on there that talk about writing and share things with each other. They'll help each other write pitches. So I end up meeting a friend through that. And so for the second event, I ended up having help with her. And I kind of told her what my book was about. She spit out a pitch for me. I put that pitch up for the next event and I got 12 agent requests. From that, I got 7 full requests for my book. And I had 2 agent calls that unfortunately they kind of fell flat after that. Because again, I didn't really know how the agent call was supposed to work. So I'm pretty sure I bombed it. We will definitely get into all that like later on in other series. But I realized when my friend wrote that pitch for me and it got so much traction, the reason it fell flat at the end of the day when I got the full request and then it just didn't come to fruition was because the pitch wasn't actually what my book was about. I was missing a really key element of stakes in my book. They just didn't exist. And that's why my pitch was so hard to write the first time. And that's why when my friend gave me the stakes and I put those in there, I got so many likes, but those stakes actually weren't in my book. So it's like,
I think
I
that's
was
such a good
realizing.
it's such a good example though for why when you write that first, it can even help with your writing throughout to really keep you in line, even if you are going to pants a novel like you did and you're not going to fully outline it, which some people do, and it works really well for them. They have the idea, they know where it's going. Um, I would argue that that is often people with a lot of experience, not always. But if you are going to sit down and pants it because you have it, you know exactly where it's going, at least having the little blurb about what you need to accomplish does give you some sort of guidelines. I think you're a key example of like why you should be writing that pitch before you write the book.
Yes. And for anybody who doesn't know this term, because I only recently learned this term, Brie, pantser is when you fly by the seat of your pants with your writing versus a plotter. So you actually like sit down and you outline, you write your plot out, you write your characters out, like you do a lot of pre-work before you're writing. And that's something we're kind of going to get into this series is where as well too, kind of like do you do that outline? What does that outline bring to the table? Do you stick to a writing schedule? Do you stick to your outline when you do take the time to make the outline? What's important in terms of character development, all that stuff. So with this series, when we're talking about like writing your book, like we're going to get into all of that. But back to the pitch. So again, the reason we start with this is to really kind of see what we could be missing in our book. And there's three types of big pitches that you can do. You can do the method one, which is introduction, inciting incident, and stakes, right? Or you can do the action centric one or the win statement. And your pitch can end in a question. It can be a question. Now, questions aren't really popular. So, like if you're writing a query and you ask the agent a question, they really don't like that. But sometimes a question can be really effective because the whole point of this pitch is to have somebody asking, well, okay, well, what next? Well, like, oh my gosh, I've got to like figure it out, right?
Absolutely. Well, even in the world of marketing, questions tend to do really well because they are either relatable or they leave you wanting more. You want to figure it out. So I would definitely say, given that we know they're not necessarily the most effective with an agent, but if yours is really good and it is a part of your hook and you've tested that, then I would lean into that if it is performing really, really well, because questions in general tend to do well with a lot of different audiences. And this is part of the reason we want to focus on this, and this part sounds harsh, but is like if your pitch isn't good, your story isn't good. And so you really, really, there are multiple reasons you want that pitch to be good. And just to reiterate what Anne was saying too, we're not talking your pitch. I shouldn't sit there and have a 5-minute conversation with you about your pitch. Your pitch really should be like 30 seconds. It should be, a couple of sentences, or think about the back of the book or the inside flap. And what do you want that to say that would entice a reader to want to read your book? Writing that first can do so much for your entire story. I know that with, hey, debut writer here on the Debut Writers podcast, that has been a huge focus of mine, is making sure that I feel so good about that
Mhm.
pitch. Even though, yes, I do some other writing, I do some different outlining and everything, but my focus has been a lot on that pitch, and it's changed until I feel so, so good about what that says and what's included. And it's helped me with I am an outliner. I'm an outliner in general life. So it makes sense that that is the way I am with writing as well, because I am that way in basically every facet of life. But it helps a lot with that, with finding the direction, with really determining a lot of those the big purposes and those big goals that we've talked about with writing.
Yes. And so when you're outlining your book, that can be so incredibly helpful. I was a pantser with my first book and my second book. But I mean, the second book was kind of outlined because it was like a whole writing course that I did with my students that year. So there was actually like a lot of outlining to it, a lot of character development, a lot of scene development. And I used all that when I turned around and wrote the book officially. But I also got contracted to write a book one time. I know, big deal, right? I was not contracted for much money. So it wasn't like game changer. But they required me to do an outline first, and they gave me this, template to put the outline together. So I had to identify like all these things about the book, and then I had to, do a 50 chapter outline bare minimum. And it really helped me so much to the point where now I'm a plotter. Now I will sit down, I will take the time, I will set up characters, I will think about the characters. What are these characters' unique features? What are their personalities? I think we've talked about this. No, I've talked about this on my inspired writer newsletter that I have on Substacks about getting inspired. I will always pick a friend. So if I'm like, this character is totally going to be Brie. So like the whole time I'm writing it, I'm thinking about, okay, well, what would Brie do? How would Brie react to this? What would she would say? And it really helps me just understand the character so much because I'm attaching them to a real person that I know. I'm not gonna call her Brie though. I'm definitely gonna call her something else like Ashley or Megan. Like I'm not gonna give her the same name. But in my mind, I try to attach every character to somebody I really know because then it really helps me anchor that character. That's just me. You can say, I really want this character to be like uh, a what is that? Robert Langdon from the Da Vinci Code. Okay, well, so as you're writing that character, think about like, what do you know about that character? What were his personality traits? What were some things that he did in that novel? Maybe twist it and like conform it to what you want the character to be. But you really, before you start writing, not only are you thinking about think about the pitch as like your ultimate plot statement. Like that pitch is that plot, like what is really happening in this story? Why is the reader going to read this? But then you also need to think about characters. Like, okay, now how are my characters going to react to this plot? How are they going to play into this plot? Knowing all of that before you start writing, I think really helps during that editing process too, because with The Lost Woman, oh my gosh, the editing process was endless. Endless, almost so many things that we had to change and go over. Characters' voices changed, how they would react. As they're like, Catherine wouldn't have done that. That's not her personality. And I'm like, well, I wasn't really sure who she was or what she was doing. So. But so having
Yeah,
some concrete understanding of your plot and characters is a really good place to start. In the last couple of series, we've talked about your vision as an author, your vision for your book, what genre is it going to sit in, what kind of author you want to be. Now that you found your identity as an author, you really need to find your book's identity.
absolutely. You're making me think about, and I don't know if I've talked about it on here before, but I probably have. One of the authors that I've done some book coaching with, there was clearly there was no pitch, there was no outline, there was no direction. A strong writer, and there was definitely something there. It just really needed to be fine tuned, and we're working on that. But part of that is your characters also have to be believable. So if they do something that is so out of character, your reader isn't going to believe it. And that's where I think
Mhm.
setting it up with the pitch, you're laying the foundation for those motivations for what this story is. And even I would say if you write it down and you just write the first thing that comes to mind for a pitch, that's probably not going to be what it is, but you at least
Yeah.
have a foundation, and then you can say, okay, well, there aren't any stakes in this, or why would that person do that? And it helps you to see those initial plot holes. And your pitch a lot of times is explaining what those motivations are going to be. I like that you said you tie characters to real people, which I think is really common, even if you're doing it subconsciously or don't want to admit it. I think people really do it. I know I had a conversation with DL Jennings on the Narratives and Nightcaps podcast, and we talked about the same thing where even and you've done this with your YA fantasy and with his fantasy book too, they're still tied to real people to an extent.
Mhm.
And he used that a lot too to say, okay, what would this person do in this situation? And if that's really helpful in developing your characters, then I would highly recommend it. I know I've done the same thing too, or I've even had people say, like, well, I want to be in your book. And I'm like, okay, I mean, I'll make you a character, I guess. Sure, no
Mhm.
problem.
You have to be careful about that because I feel like sometimes even though like Bree's in my head as I'm writing this character, maybe that character kind of takes a dark turn. Maybe that character kind of morphs into something that Bree is not really. So then you're like, oh, that character's based on me. And they're like, you would have done that. And you're like, well, not that part. I have to more so be
Not
careful
that
about the
part.
names
Yeah.
that I use. Like I was writing a story and I used the name Lucy, which is one of my best friend's little daughters. Uh, but that's not who that character is. But she's like, "Oh, my name's in your book." And then it's like, "Oh, well, maybe not that character because that's not a really good." So you've got to be really careful. I tend to always so when I'm writing, so A Lost Woman, it was so funny. A friend of mine read the book and she who knows my husband and I very well, and she calls me afterwards. She goes, "So Brett's Matt, right?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, 100%. Totally Matt." And so it was funny because she totally picked up on it. She saw so much of Matt in that character. And it's funny because in the original version, I wrote Matt over and over again. And then I did the find and change to another name. So I'll even do that sometimes to really kind of remind myself who that character is supposed to be modeling after. I'll use their real name, but then I definitely always go change it before the book goes to print because I don't want to call people out or make it too obvious. Sometimes it's, fun to have things like that in your book where people like read it and be like, oh, I wonder who this is. I wonder who this character is based off of, right? And try to figure it out. Um, but yeah, going back to the understanding your plot and your pitch, you made me think about one of my all-time favorite movies and books is The Sixth Sense. I
Yeah.
had zero idea that Bruce Willis was dead. I was so surprised by the end and I loved it. That was my first true surprise because I feel movies and books sometimes are so predictable. And to be kind of thrown off guard on that, I loved it so much. And that's the kind of writer I try to be. I try to really throw you off at the end. But you have to be so careful in writing like that because when I finished the movie, Bruce Willis is dead. I'm like, "No, there's no way. He totally talked to her. He totally did this. There's no way he's dead." You go back and you watch the movie and you're like, "He's totally dead. Damn, I missed it."
Yep.
And so it's like that's what I want people to see in my writing. So like with A Lost Woman, there's a huge twist at the end, but there's clues throughout the entire book. It's not this big surprise ending that I just like tossed out. So I am currently listening to this book on tape. It's like The Intuitive Editor. And it's such a good book, by the way, if you're trying to like, we can post some of these books too, Brie, about like books you could really read to learn how to just really improve your writing game. Like Saves the Cat Writes a Novel, The Intuitive Editor. I mean, like these are some really
The
good books.
Emotional Thesaurus. Yeah, we can
Yeah.
definitely share
Yeah.
some of those.
All these books are like really great things to like read before you write because it gives you an understanding of like the expectation. But it was so interesting because it was like, no reader wants like think of the movie the show Lost. The whole thing, you go, you go, you go, you go, and then all of a sudden, like, just kidding, they were all dead the whole time. And you're like, wait, that what? What a cop out. Like you don't want to cop out. You don't want to come up with some like
And these
rogue random ending.
and don't tell us that we've spoiled these things because they've been out for a very long time. So
I know. I didn't even watch
we're not
Lost, but I know that's how that ends.
we're not
It's
we're not spoiling anything because like these things have been out. So
yes.
but
So I
I want to
read
say for genres like that, for like psychological fiction, like you've written for mystery, suspense, thrillers, I I know people out there are very talented and can do it. And so this is definitely me putting on like again, my personal I need to outline basically everything. But especially for those where you do have to kind of give those clues and the red herrings, I
Mhm.
think that one, starting with your pitch is crucial, and then at least having a basic outline for where those are going to be incorporated is so important. Or in the editing, you're going to be going back and putting some of those in if you do just pants the novel, because some of those things are going to be left out, but you need to incorporate all of that. So your genre is important. That's why we've talked about understanding that, knowing where yours is going to sit. Um, Psychological fiction, like with A Lost Woman too is so, it includes so much about like emotional and mental motivations too. So I think
Mhm.
outlining that and knowing that from the start is so crucial for your genre.
Yes, because when I didn't do that and I pants that novel, every time I changed even one little thing, it was like ripples in the water. Like you drop, you like, okay, I'm just gonna change this one thing. That ripples throughout your whole book. So, like, to have a really good, strong, which I know outlines have mixed reviews, but I
They
honestly,
do.
I think we're both kind of like on the side of outlines. When you take the time to really outline the book and have a strong idea of just generally where it's going, your pitch, your plot, then it really does help in that editing process because it really does make it a lot easier because you're finding all those holes before you ever even start. So as you're writing, you're keeping that in the back of your mind. So many things like I think you should almost create a vision board as an author for your book. Like with all the stuff we've talked about, like in series one, like your vision as an author, your vision for your book, and then like your vision, like who, like put pictures of your target audience and put pictures of your genre, like favorite authors, and just and then with the book, like character board and all that, like just make a vision board. Those are still popular, right? Or am I showing my age?
Not at all. I mean, I like them. I think it's a smart idea to actually have that. It kind of gives you visuals to tie to your book vision, your author vision, and those can be really helpful with staying on track for all of it. And while both of us clearly lean toward outlining, ultimately I would say like you have to figure out what works for you. And
Mhm.
so we want to give you the different tips, but one of those is going to be no matter how you go about writing your book, and we'll talk through that throughout the series, start with your pitch. Figure out
Mhm.
what that is. Know where your book is going at least, or where you want it to go, and obviously you have the freedom to change that if you're down the road and you think, "Oh my goodness, this is what that needs to be." But lay the foundation for what that is. Know what your book hook is. I can't tell you how I use that now with every single author I
Yep.
talk to, with myself. I say, okay, what's the book hook? What is
Yeah.
the book hook? Um, Even, I mean, I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with someone who their book is written, and I was going through, I was like, okay, what's your book hook? Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about it. And they had something for what it was, and I go, and we kind of work through. I go, okay, well, does that book hook really resonate with readers? And I go, or
Mhm.
is that book hook heavily your emotions behind it? And they were like, oh yeah, no, this is really. I go, okay, we need to find the book hook that actually appeals to other people, isn't just like, well, I wrote this because A, B, C, X, Y, Z. I'm like, that's not a book hook.
Yeah.
So figuring those things out. So let's talk really quickly about what are some of the four common elements of a pitch. And if you want to refer to these, they're all going to be in our newsletter too, along with some additional links and tips. But let's just quickly talk through what are some four common elements of a pitch. We've talked about the three different types of book hooks, which really include your pitch, but what are some four things that are typically included?
So you need to have kind of the introduction, and really, it's not like an introduction to the story. It's an introduction to your protagonist, your main character. Like, kind of like pump it out there because really, as much as your plot is kind of the central space of your story, characters are going to drive that plot. So we really need to know, okay, what character am I going to be connecting the most within this book, right? So the protagonist's characteristics, that's something you need to know. Like shy 14-year-old Ellie, or never been outside of her house because she has a chronic illness, Megan. Like something to where like this is your main character, and this is some of the defining characteristics that are going to play into the story, that are going to help this character specifically drive the plot. And then that, every book starts with that status quo, like this is life, this is what we're doing. And then there's that inciting incident, that catalyst, like what just changed everything and is basically propelling that character on the story, because and it can't be a choice. Like, it has to be something that is forcing this character to go down this path, even if they have like the inner choice to do it. For the writer and the story and the plot, this inciting incident has to be non-negotiable. Like, it's
Right.
going to start the story, right?
Was there some sort of tragedy that impacted
Mhm.
them? Is I mean, is this like a dystopian novel where there has been an apocalyptic type scenario that they had no control over that? What situation or event has set up the trajectory for this character?
Yeah. Or like, I mean, take Harry Potter, like status quo. He's just living his horrible life in his little cupboard. All of a sudden, you're getting invited to Hogwarts and you're magical. And it's like, I mean, he had the choice to go to Hogwarts, but was it really a choice? I mean, we're going, right? Like, this was the like the inciting incident. Like, we get a little intro into Harry, who he is, and then that inciting incident. Now we're moving on to Hogwarts. But without any stakes, that story falls flat. So then that's the other component you need to have. What are the stakes of your story? What is the problem? What is the action? The stakes is what propels the story forward with your character. The character has how they're reacting to the stakes. So the stakes and the character are kind of playing together as you roll through this story. So what's at stake here is, they're trying to kill Harry. They want to get the Sorcerer's Stone and they want to bring Voldemort back to life. Harry can't let that happen because Voldemort would 100% go and kill him. Now, the stakes don't always have to be life and death. They can be less, and they can also change throughout your story. But what is the main thing at stake for your character? Like, identify that, because that's kind of when you like, here's the character, here's how their life has changed, and then they've got to do this, are like done. I always said, like, with my students, I was like, the plot moment, the stakes are the dun dun dun, like, oh my god, what's gonna happen, like, I've got to read it, right? So that's kind of like what you're thinking about, that when you're thinking about, like, okay, well, what's at stake for this character. And then I always say, add in some unique element. And we've talked about this in previous episodes about, why are you the author to write this story? What is so uniquely you in this story? Because if you read Saves the Cat Writes a Novel, that author talks about there are 10 genres, and they're not psychological thriller, they're not, contemporary fiction, they're not romantasy. This is like, there are 10 different types of novels that you can write. There's like the whodunit novel, the budding love novel, the rite of passage novel. So like not like the genres in the way you would think of them, right? But there's 10 different ways to write a novel. And every novel has to fall into one of those. And if you don't, then you're not really writing something that people want to read, in all honesty. So like, going there and like, if you get that book and you look and you say, okay, here are the 10 genres, like, what would my book fall into? And do I have the key elements that that book requires? And then what is my uniqueness on that story? So a lost woman really could be identified as who done it. Like, there's a mystery to it, that it opens up with
Yours
somebody
starts with
dying.
a mystery. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
you're immediately like, what happened? Who done?
yes. And so that's pulling you throughout the entire story, is your need to not just know what happened, but the why. The why is so important in a who done it, right? And but then it's like the blood inside me is very, it starts as a rite of passage, but then it kind of shifts into institutionalization. Like, you're trying to break the institution. Like, she has to become a hunter by blood, and she has to kill werewolves. Well, her best friend and the guy she's falling in love with is a werewolf. So what, is she going to kill him? Like, this is somebody she loves, and he's not an animal like everybody tells her he is, but yet at the same time, because she's like destined to be this hunter, if she doesn't become one, they're going to kill her anyways, like, because they're out to like eliminate anyways. So it's like this rite of passage, like, she's changing, she's got to become this adult now. Her mom dies, of course, a classic Disney of like, you got to kill off a parent to like get the story started, which I hate. I like look back at that book and I'm like, oh my God, I did the one thing I like hate in all movies is like the killing off of the parent to like get a movie started. But but yeah, so it's like I look back though and I think, okay, do I have the right elements in that story? And if I'm rewriting Twilight, basically, because it's such a ripoff, it's like, okay, what makes this story different though? What makes it uniquely Anne Brooks and not Stephanie Myers? So I think that that's something in part of those four T's. It's not necessarily something you put in your pitch, but it is something you need to know and understand going in.
It might not be your pitch, but it could be the back of your book or your inside flap
Mhm.
too. Like it still should be enticing. It's not going to be your book hook and it's not going to be one or two sentences. It might be a paragraph or two paragraphs, but those elements are going to essentially outline either your book or your outline. They're going to outline your
Yeah.
outline. And then, and it can change. You can come back to it. We're in these early stages, you're starting your book, all of that can change, but lay the foundation for who those characters are, what's happening to them, why is it important, what are they trying to solve, or what is the problem, and then what makes it you, what makes
Yeah.
it stand out, what makes it different. It's
Yeah.
I think a lot of us, and I know not everyone, a lot of us kind of have this dream of writing and we think, oh, we'll just sit down and write a book too. And it can't, like, we can all do it. We'll all sit down and write a book. But this is partly, I think that there's a lot to be said for understanding and learning the craft of writing.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go get an MFA. You don't. But even talking with Jenny too, she didn't just land this deal. Like we've talked about this, she put in a lot of work to do that. She did learn the craft of it. And with putting all of those features together, she created a great story. She had an incredible book hook. And that was how she was able to get this great agent and this amazing deal. And she's continued to like work through all of that and always knows, okay, I have to have a book hook for this.
Mhm.
So that's partly what we want to do with all of this is help you to learn the craft, which
Mhm.
Anne has been through and I've been through kind of on the flip side and continue to do as I write along. And so this entire series now is about writing your book. And we're going to talk about some of the different ways to do it. But think about what your pitch is. Even
Yeah.
if you have 50,000 words, have you written your pitch? Or do you know what your book hook is? Lay out those elements, actually write them down. Don't just keep them in your brain. Like put them on a piece of paper, type them out, create a vision board if that's going to be helpful for you to visualize your characters and where they're going and what's happening. I think I know you said you're like, does that age me? I don't think it does at all. I think people still do it. Actually, I know people still do it. I was talking to Adib Karam, and like I know that he has like a Pinterest board, that like a hidden one for his book. So it's really common to do that, and I think it can be really helpful. And
Oh, I
that
like
is,
that, a Pinterest board for your book?
yeah.
That
Oh,
would be
even if you
exciting
hide
just
it,
to, like.
yeah, it was so funny. I'm pretty sure it's in our episode with him, but he goes like, I have a super secret Pinterest board for my book. And so when it came time to cover design, he gave it to the cover designer and was like, this is super secret. You can't share this with anyone, but this is my mood board for this book.
Oh,
And
I love it.
so, yeah, so think about that too. When you write this book and you've gone through all these steps, if that is your goal is to hand over that Pinterest board to the cover designer because you've made it and you've got that book deal. And that said, you have all of these characters that you've envisioned and you want to hand over that Pinterest board for
Mhm.
what that looks like to make your cover. Just like you visualize it, it's going to help other people visualize it too. So, all of that is coming up next episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about shocker outlining and why to do it. So, stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as our newsletter for all of those additional tips and links. And then tune into our next episode.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.